Hello, everyone. Hi. Welcome to this thematic dialogue on urban flood resilience. My name is Lucy Price, and welcome to this thematic dialogue on urban flood resilience. My name is Lucy Price, and welcome to this thematic dialogue. My name is Lucy Price, and there's a bit of an echo on my side. I hope not for you. Welcome to this thematic dialogue. My name is Lucy Price, and I have the privilege of moderating this thematic dialogue, which aims to focus specifically on flood management in ASEAN. This thematic dialogue, which aims to focus specifically on flood management in ASEAN. I see the problem. I will turn off my front stage. Ooh. I hope everyone's still with me and hasn't left due to all of the echo craziness. All right, so good to go. So today I have the privilege of moderating this special thematic dialogue, which aims to focus specifically on flood management in ASEAN, a critical issue that several ASEAN cities are facing. So for those of you just tuning in, throughout this forum, different thematic dialogues have offered the opportunity to discuss and reflect on the main areas that the ASEAN Sustainable Urbanization Strategy, or ASUS, identifies as priorities for ASEAN cities to further sustainable urbanization. This also supports the ASEAN Agreement on Disaster Management and Emergency Response Work Program aimed towards building disaster resilient and safer communities, reducing disaster losses through our joint response to disaster emergencies. And a quick recap on the ASEAN Sustainable Urbanization Strategy, or ASUS. So this is a sustainable urbanization framework launched in 2018 to provide ASEAN cities with an analysis of urban trends and priority areas for urban development in the region, along with 2 accompanying toolkits that aim to assist local governments in ASEAN to advance sustainable urbanization in their cities. So one of the priority areas identified by ASUS is built infrastructure, which includes urban resilience as one of its priority sub-areas, with the development of flood management solutions as a priority action. So today we are here to talk about resilient flood risk management. Floods affect more people globally than any other natural hazard. With 80% of the ASEAN region surrounded by water, the region's highly prone to water-related hazards such as floods, cyclones, and stormwaters. And of course, today we will have a specific focus on flooding, and in particular, growing threats such as urbanizing cities ASEAN member states are facing, the threats of urbanization compounded by climate change, rapid population growth, urbanization, hazard-prone areas, and the increasing frequency and intensity of extreme weather events, coupled with poor infrastructure maintenance, growing infrastructure gaps, which have led to insufficient expansion or even the deterioration of flood management systems in many ASEAN cities, reducing their functionality. So according to an OECD study, 6 out of 12 ASEAN cities are in the top 1/3 of cities globally most prone to flooding. However, as you also well know, cities in ASEAN member states are implementing a range of strategies, policies, plans, and infrastructure to reduce flood risk and enhance resilience. So really looking forward to this session today, which aims to share knowledge and increase participants' awareness on the challenges and opportunities for ASEAN cities related to flood risk management solutions. And we have a stellar panel today, including a local government representative and experts from the public and private sector who will reflect on integrated approaches and innovative solutions that can support cities in overcoming flooding challenges and in identifying the needs of vulnerable communities. So, of course, we are here as a community to learn and exchange, and you play a key role in that. So please make good use of the chat function, share your questions, and make sure to write which speakers you're addressing throughout this hour session. And the agenda today for the session will be as follows. We will start with one presentation from a city representative who will share experiences and recommendations on flood management solutions. And following this, we will have a panel discussion on some shared challenges, related experiences, as well as on existing and emerging solutions for urban flood resilience. And we will wrap up with all of your questions from the audience, followed by a short conclusion. All right, so without further ado, joining us today to share an overview of the city context and opportunities for resilient flood management, it's my pleasure to introduce Ms. Antoinette Anaban, City Planning and Development Coordinator, Disaster Risk Reduction and Management Officer of Baguio City, Philippines. Thanks so much for joining, Ms. Anaban. And for the further discussion, we will also be joined by expert practitioners, including Mr. Boahom Sengkanyam, UN Habitat Lao PDR Country Office Chief Technical Advisor and Project Team Leader for Water for Asian Cities, Ms. Fiona Barber, Mott McDonald, Global Flooding Lead, greeting us from Edinburgh, and Mr. Werner Gruber, Head of Cooperation, Embassy of Switzerland in Vietnam, Swiss Cooperation Office based in Hanoi, as well as Hans Gutmann, Asian Disaster Preparedness Center Executive Director, joining us from Bangkok, Thailand. So I'm really pleased to hand this over to Ms. Annette Anaban, who will start this session with a city context presentation on Baguio City, Philippines, and share more on the flood management advances evolving out of the ASEAN Australian Smart Cities Trust Fund. Over to you, Ms. Anaban. Thank you.
Thank you so much for the introduction. Allow me to go straight to my presentation as there is time limit to this presentation. So Baguio is popularly known, next slide please. Baguio is popularly known, next please, as the summer capital of the Philippines due to its cold climate. The city was designed for 25,000 to 30,000 people. However, with rapid urbanization, it has already reached a population of 366,000 in 2020, with an annual population growth rate of 1.2% from years 2015. Baguio City also plays significant roles, such as the prime education center of North Philippines, a major tourist destination in the country, the center for trade and industry, and the seat of national government offices in the region. Next slide, please. So some people might be asking, how come there is flood in the city of Baguio when it is located above 1,500 miles elevation? You should also understand that Baguio is one of the cities in the entire Philippines with the highest number or the highest amount of rainfall. Flooding occurs mainly in the low-lying areas, which are subjected to a number of flood incidents in the past years. Among the underlying causes that worsens Baguio's exposure and vulnerability towards flood disasters include, first, the limited capacity of the drainage system and waterways, which cannot contain excessive or increasing rainfall. Second, is the blockage of drainage and waterways due to accumulation of garbage. Third is the frequent landslides as a result of heavy rainfall. And lastly is the narrowing of waterways due to the encroachment of built-up structures along the easement areas. By being exposed and having a high vulnerability to climate hazards, combined with the expansion of impervious paved areas within the city and its surrounding, Baguio is experiencing increasing runoff volumes and flood damages, as these impacts are expected to be compounded by climate change, which will likely cause an increase in the frequency and intensity of rainfall events and further exacerbate flooding events and rain-induced landslide. Next, please. Recognizing the relevance of innovation and technology in efficiently carrying out our government functions, we have a number of smart city system initiatives. Our Smart City Command Center, the Baguio in My Pocket, the digitalization of LGU processes and cashless transactions. Just recently, Baguio City has forged an agreement with the Department of Information and Communication Technology for the setting up and operation of critical digital infrastructure, particularly the National Government Data Center and Digital Transformation Center in the city. And this will be a design, build, and co-managed by both parties. Next, please. Aligned to the development direction of the city, the Asian Development Bank approved the establishment of the ASEAN, Australia Smart Cities Trust Fund, with financing provided by the Government of Australia through the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade. It is through this mechanism that the trust fund is supporting Baguio City in implementing the flood early warning, information, and mitigation system project. The project is assisting the city with both the planning for flood mitigation and the delivery of the services of flood early warning and responses using smart technologies. The end goal of the flood early warning system development for Baguio City is to improve the city's resilience to flooding and facilitate early preparedness. The value added by the flood early warning system development in the current project is an increase in reaction lead time by the way of forecasting future water levels in the main streams and the risk of floods in the city of Baguio. Next, please. The project involves the development of a smart flood early warning system, incorporating a real-time data capture system, outreach and dissemination planning and engagement activities, on-the-job training, and supported by the development of a flood mitigation action plan. Furthermore, under the twinning and the networking component of the project, a mentor city will be identified and a subsequent program of exchange and capability building activities will be developed. The flood early warning system will be developed with other key stakeholders to improve community disaster preparedness, raise awareness, and ensure ownership. The flood early warning system is also set to become an integral element within the overall vision of Baguio City to become a truly resilient, dynamic, and smart city. Next, please. Two of the project outputs have been completed already so far. The first was the baseline assessment report, which sought to understand the current situation in Baguio in the context of the project's main components such as climate change assessment, hazard mapping, and flood early warning. It also looked at the availability and quality of data and information that is available to support the implementation of the project and the gaps that could impact the overall project results and which actions can and will be taken to fill those gaps. Next, please. The second output was the hydraulic model and hazard risk mapping, which sought mainly to determine the main rivers, drivers, mechanism, characteristics, and impacts of the flooding and landslides in the city and identify where the most flood-prone areas are. It also examined how the city is expected to be affected by climate change and its impact on risk assessment and adaptation solutions, as well as how flood risk is understood and dealt with in Baguio. Next, please. The project team is also currently working on the following project components. First is the flood early warning system architecture, which covers the overall inception for the two phases of the flood early warning system and the plan and methodology established so far for the development of the system. Second is the data dissemination and outreach plan, which outlines the dissemination and outreach activities, information and training materials, and roles of responsibilities of key stakeholders during the four phases of the disaster management cycle. Third is the flood mitigation action plan, which will use nature-based solutions to address flood risk, including mitigation measures for future investments. And lastly, the city twinning program, where the city will be matched with a mentor city to support the implementation of smart city solutions in the city and facilitate the sharing of best practices and new ideas. Next, please. To complement and enhance the Baguio Flood Early Warning System project, a separate project under the ASEAN Australia Smart Cities Trust Fund is currently being implemented to address the need and interest of the city to implement gender transformative approaches to fuse or to flood early warning system to ensure all its citizens can benefit from the project development. This separate project, the gender transformative approach for strengthened development, application, and replication of the Baguio City Smart Flood Early Warning, aims to ensure that appropriate, applicable, and timely early warning reaches the last mile, including the most vulnerable, recognizing that the effective flood early warning system are people-centric. This project seeks to improve the understanding of decision makers about drivers of gendered vulnerability and how this affect flood early warning system needs within and between communities, link the needs of vulnerable and marginalized groups to considered and meaningful planning of preparedness and response action, and improve representation and inclusion of marginalized groups in the flood early warning system. Next, please. The project has its share of challenges, especially due to the continuing COVID-19 pandemic. Because of mobility restrictions in the country, some delays in the delivery of certain outputs were inevitable. The project team adapted its operations and approach to accommodate the unprecedented circumstances wrought by COVID-19. This included shifting to largely virtual and digital means of stakeholder engagement, city consultations, and pilot project implementations. The project team also encountered a lack of digital data, particularly for the urban drainage system in Baguio, which represented significant gaps that will affect the approach to the flood mitigation action plan. In the absence of the digital drainage data, the project team is assessing the feasibility to build a hydraulic model for the entire city. Instead, a different approach, compromising more localized hand calculations and a limited number of subcatchment is being considered. Next, please. Despite these challenges, a silver lining that the current pandemic has highlighted is the value of digital solutions in ensuring the continuation of essential urban services and delivery of time-sensitive information to the public amidst restricted movement and physical contact. The strong political will and commitment of the city government, led by our city mayor, is also a big factor, as without the close coordination and support of the city government, it would be more difficult to advance the development of smart digital solutions in the city. It also helps that even prior the implementation of the smart and resilient resilient system, the project is the city has already been envisioned to transform the city into a smart and resilient city. The engagement of various city stakeholders during certain stages of the project is also a very important factor to ensure that we are getting the necessary feedback on their issues and concerns for integration in the project. The city has also received very strong support from the project's technical team, led by the Danish engineering and consulting firm Rumble, who, despite not being able to physically travel to the city, have been assisting us in the implementation of this project. Next, please. Baguio is very fortunate to be part of this pilot project, and so we would like to thank the Government of Australia through the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade and the Asian Development Bank, the Rumble, for the strong support that they are currently providing to the city. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ms. Anaban, for the incredibly comprehensive overview of all of the achievements underway in Baguio City, from the establishment of flood early warning systems to your real-time monitoring, preparation of flood mitigation plans, and all of that also rooted in engaging and empowering those most vulnerable. Really impressive work, and really appreciated, as others did, I'm sure, of the sharing of those success factors. So the value of digital solutions, the strong level of local government political will to engage and push this forward, as well as the backbone of technical expertise you had at hand. I'm sure today's panelists also have a lot of feedback to your presentation. I would like to invite them to the stage if possible. Thank you very much. Good to see you. Good to see you all. So maybe we start first with a question to you, Ms. Anaban. Essentially, maybe you can share with us some of the main technical and strategic areas that other ASEAN local governments might benefit from in terms of capacity strengthening, technical support, and training initiatives related to flood risk management, and also maybe connected to that view on that city twinning program you mentioned and that city-to-city learning that you're going to be advancing on. Thanks.
Yeah, I think knowledge and capacity building or training will be beneficial in areas that will improve the city government's forecasting, response, early warning capacity, like technical advances in flood early warning systems, designing flood risk mitigation and management plans, disaster recovery planning, processing, analyzing available data from flood management infrastructure, and available financing that can help city to enhance their flood risk management methodologies. And of course, the city also will be benefiting with the twinning network uh, component of the project, especially that we will be learning from them. So it is also the best opportunity for us to learn from each other, and for the mentor city to guide us in improving further our flood early warning system. Thank you.
Thank you. I also invite our esteemed experts. If you have any feedback to Ms. Anaban's presentation and what's underway in Baguio, please feel free to raise your hand and step in. Go ahead, Ms. Barber. Thanks.
Yeah, just picking up on the point you said at the end about the lack of data. Do you think that generally when taking these programs forward, there is more of a blocker in terms of accessing the data, or is it just that the data does not exist, or partly both? Which do you think for these programs is the challenge?
Yeah, the drainage data in the city is actually should come from the Department of Public Works and Highways, which is a national government, and it's at the same time from the City Engineering Office. Unfortunately, these data are not existing, and so with the that's why we are very thankful that the flood early warning system project is very timely to have chosen the city of Baguio as the pilot for this project, because it really helps us a lot, and it has an implication in our planning and also in policy recommendation, because we can only say so much about flooding, but we do not have any data which we can base from what we are saying.
Thanks so much for that question, Ms. Barber. Actually, that was one of the questions that I wanted to save, one of the best for last questions to address all of you. So it would be good to hear from the panel. I'm going to put a pin in that point on data management, data quality. And I'd like to also circle back. So Ms. Anaban, you mentioned a lot of the capacity strengthening and development required in order to advance flood management. Mr. Sangkam-Yong, I know that you also have many years of integrated flood management, many years of experience, which require a range. You've been engaged in a range of multi-stakeholder endeavors, right? Because this type of work requires, a lot of coordination between government departments, both at the local and national levels, which can be challenging for many cities. So in your opinion, how can we effectively engage relevant stakeholders to ensure vertically integrated, scaled solutions? And building on Baguio City's example, what are your recommendations to really integrating vulnerable communities into flood risk management planning processes? vertically integrated, scaled solutions. And building on Baguio City's example, what are your recommendations to really integrating vulnerable communities into flood risk management planning processes? Mr. Sang-Ham-Young, I think you have the same problem I had. You have to click out of one of the front stage tab on your browser, so the echo goes away. So you're only in the backstage. And you're muted. Maybe problem I had. You have to click out of one of the maybe while you figure out a few of the tech issues, I will move on to some other questions for panelists and return to you once some of those tech issues are solved. So, Mr. Gruber, I know you have vast bilateral, multilateral economic development cooperation expertise. And often cities say, we know what we have to do. We know what the innovative solutions are. We just need the funding. So could you give some of our attendees, some of our participants today, some recommendations in terms of accessing sustainable funding mechanisms for infrastructure, and share some recommendations and or best practices based on Switzerland's work with ASEAN cities on how to successfully integrate flood management initiatives into the city priorities and ensure their financial sustainability?
Yes, thank you very much. And thank you very much for having me. It is really a great pleasure. So Switzerland is supporting several urban development projects and urban resilience projects in the ASEAN region. And I'm very pleased to be able to share some of the experience. Perhaps before I go into the funding, sustainable funding issues, let me start by emphasizing the importance of a proper risk-based planning of strategies, policies, plans, and infrastructure to manage flood risk and enhance resilience. So this includes obviously a proper risk assessment, a risk-based approach on the prevention measures and emergency planning, and finally also preparing precautionary measures to be able to cover the remedial risks, for instance, through disaster risk insurance. Now, on the funding issues, I think there are basically, perhaps roughly speaking, three ways to assure funding for sustainable flood management. And the first one would probably be to use general public budget funding. The second one would be actually to assure funding through a utility and financed then by beneficiaries and consumers through a public service tariff scheme. And the third one is then access to private funding or through a special vehicle or through public-private partnerships. I think in practice, these three ways of funding are probably going to be mixed and complemented with each other. So, but looking at these three from the experience of our projects, perhaps let me quickly run through some examples for actually each of them. I think one quite innovative idea is about the use of land-based fiscal tools actually for financing. So in several cities in Vietnam and in Indonesia, urban resilience projects have actually supported a land evaluation process, which aimed at helping the cities to define strategies to leverage the increase of land value created by such investments. So these kind of calculations actually of the increase of market value of the land can be used to leverage public funding and to support also the pass on of costs for infrastructure and maintenance to developers and landowners, for instance, through property taxes. So these land-based fiscal tools can be utilized to raise finance for urban flood resilience measures, given that these measures obviously contribute to the improvement actually of the usable land. As a second example, and now more about the support to public utilities, one of our projects in favor of cities in the Mekong Delta actually was about developing a sustainable tariff schemes for the city's water drainage utilities. So the challenge here has, of course, been to determine the current and future operation and the maintenance costs for the drainage system, and to calculate also the revenue requirements and then the customer tariffs. The advantage of this scheme is that the funding will be provided by those who benefit directly from the flood management scheme. But it is also important to consider that, as the experience shows, that such schemes need to be introduced usually in a phased approach along the constructions and improvement also of the flood management system, and should be accompanied by targeted subsidies for the poor and vulnerable, if necessary. And lastly, as a kind of still very anecdotal on funding mechanism, let me touch upon the way to access actually private financing. So what we did in Vietnam is to work on the possibility to set up an infrastructure financing facility for cities, which actually would allow to operate as a commercial oriented entity, and would then raise medium and long-term capital from domestic and foreign sources to be invested then in municipal infrastructure projects. So there have been some pilot studies on that, but unfortunately it has not been possible yet to implement these kind of a scheme due to the necessary still also institutional arrangements which are not in place yet. So overall, I think these examples show there are innovative and ways actually to assure sustainable financing also for sustainable flood infrastructure and flood management measures. I think from our experience we can say, and I think this is also reflected in the presentation we had, to be able to successfully implement sustainable flood management systems, cities need to have, first of all, the delegated authority at the city level to implement these measures. It is important also that they work very closely with all the other stakeholders. I think a point which had been mentioned before as well. And also that they coordinate and manage closely among all the different departments and ministries involved in these kind in setting up a comprehensive flood management system. I think costs and benefits need to be well understood and clearly communicated. And then obviously in terms of financing, it is critical that the city authorities have again the fiscal space and funding and revenue channels, which allow them actually to be able to set up a sustainable financing for these measures. And lastly, there needs to be an enhanced regulatory framework for municipal borrowing also, to be able to access private financing. So let me close here and by just saying again that these measures are critical and become even more important, and I think there are ways actually to sustainably finance them. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. So many wonderful recommendations to dig into. While you were speaking, Mr. Gruber, first of all, I really like the fact that you start all of this as a red thread. All of the Ms. Anaban, Mr. Gruber, everyone has started by saying it is important. You first have to take an evidence and risk-based approach across all that we do. You also mentioned Mekong, and that sparked my wanting to ask Mr. Hans Gutmann to share a bit about, with your Asian Disaster Preparedness Center hat on, but also thinking back to your time as CEO of the Mekong River Commission Secretariat, supervising the implementation on the Mekong Agreement on transboundary water management, but also before we entered the panel today, you were speaking about the disaster response work that you led in the region over that time. So maybe you could reflect a bit on your experience. What does it take, building on what Mr. Gruber said, what does it take really to engage vast stakeholders and really scale up collaboration and cooperation? And how can we better converge this nexus between humanitarian and development community as support systems to local government and upwards?
Thank you. That's not quite a yes and no question, but we'll move ahead. No, I think what has been mentioned before, I mean, it's very critical in all of these areas to have some anchoring and founding in what's happening on the ground and what evidence there are, because it's easy to draw conclusions from circumstantial evidence, which then leads you in the wrong direction. I also think what has been mentioned, I mean, one of the key issues in this whole area, by risk assessments, you have the ability to start looking into what can be done in the risk reduction part, in reducing the potential impacts, etc. And with a good early warning system and reaching the last mile, you have a preparedness ability to be able to deal with the disasters as, or in this case, the flood as it is impinging. Because particularly in Southeast Asia, but across the world, the flood, yes, there's the immediate damage, but there is also the lingering effects, which then causes other problems in terms of access to clean water, the inability to have electricity, and all of these things that are critical actually for fundamentals working in an urban city. Not everybody thinks so much about it, but I mean, what tends to happen in urban areas when you have floods is that they turn off the electricity because it's dangerous. But what do you do, particularly if you sit in an apartment block when you don't have electricity? You don't have any water because the pumps doesn't work and everything. So the knock-on effects are quite huge. And likewise, I mean, we go back, and the floods in Bangkok 2011 just demonstrates that urban floods and floods of these urban bigger cities and the surrounding areas have knock-on effects, not only because of the affected population at the time and surprise issues such as where do you park your car? They were parked all over the place on the flyovers and other things, and how do you get safe water? But also the whole industry and getting back to business again. Now, I think if we go through the sort of key elements that were mentioned, risk reduction, preparedness, and importantly, preparedness, and I think this is something that Baguio City will be increasingly looking at in terms of, you put the preparedness in place, you have the things of what to do, the flash floods that occurs when those heavy rainfalls are dangerous, etc. But once it's been put in place and tested, there then needs to be drills on a regular basis. This needs to be tested. And I think the floods in Europe in July is a testament to that. It was an extreme event, but there has also not been really a lot of testing and drillings of what you do when the disaster strikes in Germany. And if you compare to the Netherlands, which has much more cultural affinity to having all of these things practiced, the impacts were quite less. Okay, they may be more extreme in Germany at the time, but it proves a certain point. And I think also it's important to look into then the recovery. There are the opportunities of making things better. and it's not always easy to see. Now, with the fiscal issues, and I think Werner touched on an important set there, but I think also what will be critical for the urban managers is really to find this fit for purpose, because in some cases you want to overestimate or overinvest because of very rare but large impact events. In other cases, you probably are more willing to live with the risk because you can recover from it more easily. And a key issue there is also for whom is this investment. And we talked about inclusion, we talked about being able to make sure that we're protecting the vulnerable. And I mean, that's a very important and complicated issue in these discussions. Now, what does that mean in clear terms? For ADPC, for example, we're working in Vietnam also on urban resilience. And one important aspect of the hazards is floods. But you have to look at it on totality. You have to look at the flood part of it. What does it do to infrastructure? But also in terms of the response. Who are the people affected? If you're talking about access to clean water, access to electricity, access to nutrition for vulnerable groups such as young children who, even if it's 2 weeks with difficulties, can have problems. And I think the last part that I want to touch on, because we can go on this for a long time, is this issue that was also raised earlier. The different sectors in the government and also the government, local communities and private sector, that aspects of communication, access to information and coordination needs to be put in place long before the disasters occur, because during the disasters, if there's no clarity on who's going to do what, you get difficulties. And again, going back to Bangkok, for example, the setup of 23 agencies to try to coordinate this evidently didn't really work out at the time. There's some improvements in this area, but that's a key issue also that is boring to address, but it needs to be done. I'll leave it at that for the moment.
Wow, thank you so much, Mr. Goodman. And thanks as well for that overview, also especially of the characteristics of urban floods and what we're dealing with when we're talking about how these are increasingly interconnected, interdependent, with cascading and compounding risks as cities are basically systems of risk. So thank you for that. When it comes to some of the investments you were speaking about, I mean, for every $1 US invested in flood reduction, that saves about an average of 5 in future losses. I wanted just to turn to Ms. Barber to get another private sector perspective, looking at trends and your work with MOT. So historically, flood management, would you say it's had relatively low political salience in some ASEAN countries due to perhaps being not very visible until an extreme event occurs, or if especially successful? Or, flood management is competing with a range of other pressing urban priorities and resources, which are very visible, such as congestion, waste management. So based on your experience with Southeast Asia countries, do you see a shift here in terms of its prioritization, the prioritization of flood management, especially with the mainstreaming of climate science into strategies and plans now? Do you see that funding coming through?
What I have observed in around the region is actually very similar to what I've observed in countries globally, which is that everyone is battling with demands from the same limited resources in public funding. Flooding is always a risk that may occur where there are other needs that definitely will occur. And it's not often a lack of will, but just that the known needs are sometimes responded to quicker. However, I do think I have observed a shift in the awareness of how this problem is going to get worse with climate change. I think the recently published IPCC report helps us all realize that change is happening quicker, and more intensely than we thought it was going to. And I think this has got the topic a lot more attention, as it deserves, and has got more people, and maybe more non-technical people, to actually realize this is something that they're going to have to look at to help their cities function, and make sure that that the growth and the economic livelihood of the city can continue to happen with these increasingly frequent events. I'm involved in projects in the Philippines, Vietnam, and Bangkok, and these projects are very focused on improving the resilience of those cities. And so I think increasingly what we've heard today about Baguio City, we are starting to see a lot more attention, investment, more projects being pulled together to look at this resilience piece. But there is a lot to do, but I believe that it is getting the focus that it deserves.
Thanks so much, and good to hear it is getting the focus that it deserves. I see we have Mr. Sang Kiam Young with us again. Welcome back.
Yes, apologize for the technical problem. Yes.
Thanks for rejoining. It's good to see you and hear you again. I was wondering if you could share a bit of your current experience working in Laos with UN Habitat. Especially, I think when you dropped off, we were talking about how you are integrating vulnerable communities within your current work and with wider flood management planning at the city level.
Yes, thank you, Lucy. With Lao experience, that means so to effectively engage with, relevant stakeholder. That means we have lesson learning like it. So first we need, a balance. That means approach between national and local level. That means top to down, and then bottom to up. Since IMF is resource intensive, requiring proper institutional arrangement and financial resource at the national level. Why? That means in local level, we have to use the knowledge, the local knowledge of the community. Use the knowledge of historical as such. That means the knowledge relate to historical change, water resource, water need, and the impact of climate change. Here that oftenly feel locally, the people on the ground. So therefore, critically, that successful IMF is decentralized and participatory through a number of ways that are adaptive to the experience, social and cultural sensitive, political and priority of the local region. So we could start with, firstly, that means have to stakeholder mapping to identify the stakeholder at different level, the interest, priority, capacity, knowledge, and resource to understand the position in relation to the issue or decision being considered, as well as the level of influence over particular issue of or decision. Secondly, have to establish, that means the task force team, and also that means PIU, that means project implementation unit, where relevant stakeholders become integral part of the project implementation, including monitoring and evaluation. This would enhance transparency, accountability, and take ownership of the project. Thirdly, have to creating a better shared vision by establishing a knowledge repository, convening workshop, or online platform like ASAS do now, So where critical information on IMF can be shared with different stakeholders through the participatory process. So lesson learned, that mean we want, that mean example. Here we Lao terminology we call a Samsung, that tribune system or three-level development. So can providing the opportunity like decentralization of responsibility, that means linked to multi-level of governance, decentralization of budget, that means linked to Samsung and multi-level governance, capacity building at all levels, and public awareness and community support, flood management information system, and inclusive decision making. So on the end, for conclusion, so we can conclude that mean to make successfully, that mean implement, that mean coordinate all the way, that mean we should have, that mean like multi-dimension of flood management, that mean emphasizing and better considering the interplay between flood development process and poverty to determine how current and future development planning and implementation are leading to or have the potential to increase vulnerability and risk. That means clarify institutions and government, strengthening VA, that means assessment tool and method to improve data and decision making, building capacity at both national and local level, and also that means key also to involve of decision making and role of women, because it allow that our lesson learning mostly, that means engineer that the men, but who most affected, who that mean women, we should that involved of decision making of the role of women. And lastly, that means developing appropriate economic instrument. So here that mean my share, that mean the lesson learning from Lao. Thank you for your attention. I over to Lucy, please.
Thank you so much, Mr. Sun Kam Young. I really appreciated all those lessons from Lao, from setting up coordination mechanisms to relying on local knowledge, and really that emphasis, because often, you know, all these decisions are being made that affect flood lists, they're being made at the local, national levels, but the impacts are felt at the community level. I think that Fiona, you might have had a comment as well to Mr. Sun Kam Young's inputs.
Yes, so I just wanted to kind of reiterate that point about knowledge sharing, and probably coming back to what I was saying before about maybe the non-technical people are now getting the message, and not just in the politics, but also amongst the citizens. And I think as more people understand that the different aspects that might impact on flooding, they can and particularly in relation to the waste management, a lot of people use waterways to disperse of solid waste, and that does clog up the system. And I think perhaps with that understanding being more widely shared with the communities, as well as with the different departments maybe not involved in flood management, that maybe we can start, it's going to be a long process, but start to maybe address some of these factors that different parties can play, and not just the flood experts.
Thanks so much for that point. And true. I think, yeah, in terms of also, that links me back to this topic of communication. When we think about early warning messaging, risk communication, we need to really make sure that these messages are well understood at all levels as well. And as promised, I want to return back to that question about data. So I think it would be really nice for the panelists to answer or speak a bit more about, where we're at. Modern flood management systems rely on a variety of data, as Baguio City very well presented. We're also including census, geospatial information, as well as historic flood data. Hans and Mr. Sang Kan-yong were also speaking about really the importance of combining vulnerability, risk, capacity data into these processes as well. I know for Red Cross, Red Crescent, we really rely heavily on working together with disaster management and hydromet agencies so that we can really anticipate floods and act early based on impact, right? So setting certain triggers in order to know when to act early. And so poor quality of data has a big impact on flood management and flood forecasting accuracy and skill. But also we need to make sure that these innovative systems we're putting in place are really well understood at all levels. So I just wanted to hear a bit from the panel in terms of any recommendations or good practices you have or bad in terms of data and how that's really some lessons learned in terms of data collection, management, sharing protocols and things, and how that's affecting your resilience flood management work and cooperation with stakeholders.
Perhaps I can chip in here rapidly on this question. I think we have been speaking obviously about the proper planning process, and which includes, of course, risk assessments, which includes also then a risk-based approach on prevention measures, and then also the question, obviously, and it has been mentioned also by Hans, that how to deal with residual risk and what risks do we want to take and which one do we want to perhaps provide insurance coverage for or take them on our own risks. So I think obviously for that, and it is essential that we have access to data and understand also, for instance, where the city's flood risk are the highest. We need to be able to simulate flood impacts. We need to understand the capacity of the drainage system and also then the impact. We need to model in a way the impact of flood prevention measures. So I think, as you were saying, Lucy, I mean, the access to data is critical. Now, I think it is important that we really make use here of the new technologies, digital technologies, and I think they they open up many options. I mean, in terms of course, data collection, but then also directly in the flood management. So, as an example, I could mention what we were trying to do is a kind of a flood exposure mapping and decision support platform. What we're trying to establish in Ho Chi Minh City, which would include web interfaces for officials, web interface for the public, and then smartphone applications for data captures for officials, and also smartphone applications for the public. And I think one of the questions out of the audience was also things, and we are what indeed with the new digital technologies, this opens up possibilities for an integrated flood management also, which really links flood sensors also with the flood risk management system and entirely. So I think these new digital technologies open up many possibilities, and we need definitely to make use of them and work on these opportunities. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I see that we're running out of time, and I do want to make sure that we get our important questions from the audience to our experts. Ms. Anaban, here's one for you. I will start with, how do you integrate different technical parameters in developing a holistic tender document with respect to flood analysis versus IoT technology? I'm sorry, someone will have to tell me what this, I should know what it stands for, I'm sure, but I don't.
Internet of
Maybe.
Things.
Sorry?
Internet of Things, I believe.
Oh, thank you. Internet of technology.
Yeah. Well, I am not an IT person, but based on what we do in our project, the city is coming up with a smart city center, which we will be connecting the flood early warning system to that smart city center for the real-time monitoring of flood, and also for the gathering of data. So in the flood early warning system, we actually integrate digital solutions to that, so that we will not be monitoring flood incidents or flood incidents the way we do before, but it will be we will monitor it in a timely manner, and we can monitor it through remotely, so not necessarily going to the site. So that is the application of sensors and also geospatial data that we need to integrate in this digital solution. And also the city has this Baguio in My Pocket project, which we can actually make use of to communicate to the communities. So we want to communicate this data so that they will be more informed and be updated of what is happening around. So that will not only be exclusive for the flood management, but also for environmental monitoring and also other disaster monitoring.
I see now we are completely out of time, but I would love to just do a quick round from each of our experts today, just to hear a few keywords. What are the two keyword, either game changers we should look out for, or recommendations for our audience as closing remarks? What are the next steps for people engaging and advancing in resilient urban flood management in their cities to take home? Words of advice or one key thing to remember from your intervention today. Ms. Barber, you look ready.
I think my word for game changing is probably systems thinking. We need to start integrating flooding solutions into our other policies, into the city strategies, and look at them holistically. As flood experts, we need to learn more about the housing strategy and the other challenges of a city and the urbanisation, and they need to also learn more about the flooding stresses. So talking to each other and looking at it holistically.
Systems thinking, breaking the silos. Mr. Singham Young, over to you.
Yes, thank you, Lucy. I think that the key that mean integrate flood management, that mean have to combine, that mean technical knowledge, which that mean local community, ethnic people, that from women, that here the key. That thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Gruber.
Thank you. Many of the important things have already been said. I think for me, it is important actually to assure a really close horizontal and vertical cooperation and coordination, and to have clear also institutional responsibilities across also national, subnational authorities, and clear also fiscal roles and fiscal assignments. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Mr. Gutman.
Thank you. And as others, I'm trying to get a bit different angle. I agree with what has been said. My contribution here would be to focus on fit for purpose. There's so many things that you can do. What are you really trying to protect against? What can you live with? And what can you manage? And that will allow a more effective engagement. But of course, system thinking, clarity on scope and roles are very important parts to play into that. Thank you.
And simulate. I thought that was such a great recommendation from you earlier today. I'm going to add that to your closing remarks as well. All right. And Ms. Anaban.
Yeah, I would like to add that the adoption of a participatory, community-based, and gender transformative approach to flood management to engage and empower the vulnerable communities or marginalized groups and ensure that no one gets left behind in the adverse flood events.
Thank you so much. Thank you to all of our expert practitioners today for joining. I hope this thematic dialogue was as informative for you, the participants, as it was for me. Once this session closes, I do want to let you know you're invited to join the following session, which will be on COVID-19 recovery in ASEAN, which starts shortly in 10 minutes. So many thanks to you all for the fruitful discussion. Take care.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. See,
Bye-bye.
nice to
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.